Good morning, everybody. Welcome. It's great to see you here at our second dialogue for 2022. I'm Kimberly Collins. I'm the Executive Director of the Leonard Transportation Center. And we welcome to this really interesting conversation that we're going to have today on big data and equity within the transportation system. So to get us started today, we have a welcome from one of our partners and great colleagues, Carrie Witt. Carrie, please get us started off today.
Thank you, Dr. Collins. And on behalf of all of my HNTV colleagues, I'd like to welcome you to the Leonard Transportation Center's Regional Mobility Dialogue Series. And this is season 5, episode 2. And that's just remarkable to say. You know, we've been working with Dr. Collins and everyone at LTC for more than 5 years now on this program. And as I attend, this is our 27th dialogue that we've produced together, and they just keep getting better. And that's a very good sign. It's very invigorating. And today is no exception. You know, big data and equity are both major topics, not just in transportation, but in society. And when we talk about equity, the definition of the issues and the solutions to those issues are sometimes a little bit hard to pinpoint. You know, inequities exist and we all know it, but often it's more of a feeling than being able to demonstrate it and show it. And as we look for solutions to the inequities that we observe and that we feel, it's hard. We need to first define what equity looks like. And the answer to that is also sometimes a little bit nebulous. It's kind of, I'll know it when I see it. It will feel right. And as engineers and planners, we tend to like to think a little bit more quantitatively. And so in defining the problem and measuring the results of our efforts to improve equity, we need something more than it feels right. And that's why I'm really excited about the advances that we're going to hear about today, which really focus on using data to define the issues and measure the effectiveness of the efforts that we're putting in place to try to address those issues. And that's a really important concept, is being able to measure our progress to improving equity. We're going to hear from 2 experts who are going to talk about the cutting edge work that they're doing in this area. And then it's always a treat to hear from our student researchers. And we do that several times each season. We hear from researchers at the universities that are partnering with and affiliated with Leonard Transportation Center, and that's always a treat. So I want to remind you that this is not a lecture, it's a dialogue. And so we've saved plenty of time at the end for discussion and for questions and answers. And I really think I think we'll all agree that these are more interesting and more fun if everyone participates. So as you're listening to the opening presentations today, be thinking of things that you might want to contribute or questions that you might have for our speakers. So thank you again for attending, and back to you, Dr. Collins.
Thanks so much, Carrie. It's great to have you here as always. And it's wonderful to be able to partner with HNTB over these past, I guess, 5 years now, which it's something for us who are on the planning side here. We've never thought this would happen. Normally we have a dean or associate dean speak today, but unfortunately I don't believe that they're with us. And so we're just going to jump right in. As Carrie noted to you, we will have a series of polls and conversation pieces. So we're going to start off before we get to our first speaker, our first poll. And so please, these are pretty much anonymous. If you could just answer and give us your thoughts on this question. In your opinion, the most traffic in the region is generated from travel within the same county, with Riverside or within San Bernardino, within the bi-county region of the Inland Empire, through the region to another place or outside the Inland Empire, or other, please note in the chat. So as we can see from this question, the majority, 50%, think that it's through the region to another place outside of the Inland Empire, while 38% say that it's within the bi-county region, and then the smallest percent is within the same county. So we're going to hear from our next speaker, Chris Tang, from the WRCOG, or the Western Riverside Council of Governments. And Chris, I'd like to invite you up to start your presentation and share with us the results of the work that you've been doing over at the WRCOG.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Collins. Hopefully everyone can hear me and can see this. So good morning, everyone. Christopher Zhang from the Western Riverside Council of Governments. Thank you so much for inviting us to be a part of the conversation. Hopefully we provide a glimpse as to how we have utilized big data. We've started to utilize big data. I'm here to present a travel behavior analysis that our agency conducted for our member agencies utilizing big data. Unfortunately, the analysis didn't address transportation equity as a topic, but I hope we are able to provide a glimpse of how we utilize big data to answer a question that was posed about one of our programs and how we utilized big data as a part of the conversation and really address some of the issues of transportation in Western Riverside County. So just as an intro, because councils of governments aren't exactly a household government entity, WRCOG as an agency has represented our member agencies since 1991. Our member agencies include 18 jurisdictions, the county, 2 water districts, and the Riverside County Superintendent of Schools. This map shows the geographic area of Western Riverside County, which spans from Corona on the west, Banning to the east, and Temecula to the south. And of course, the unincorporated county area makes up a lot of our area. So what is a COG and how do they fit into the regional picture? So it's formed through JPA, a Joint Powers Authority, and they're also known as regional councils, regional commissions, or regional planning commissions. WRCOG is the regional planning agency for Western Riverside County, and we are directed by our members, which are comprised of local governments. So that's nice and all, but what can a regional planning agency do? So WRCOG itself, we actually conduct a number of programs that fill in the gaps, and really, I think the main kind of what our main focus is we leverage resources at a larger scale. We're able to generate economies of scale as it relates to issues that transcend jurisdictional boundaries. So if you take transportation, for example, transportation issues and challenges, they don't really stop at a city or a county boundary. We do want to be careful though, so we always come back to how it benefits our local jurisdictions. So the main reason why I'm here today is to discuss how we utilize big data for our transportation uniform mitigation fee program. WRCOG as an agency, we administer this program on behalf of our member jurisdictions. The program provides funding to major arterial roadways to accommodate for regional travel within the WRCOG subregion. The funding comes by way of an impact fee on new development. These fees are meant to mitigate transportation impacts that come from the new development. So since 2003, we've been able to provide about $400 million in funding to the jurisdictions. Has in turn been leveraged into $1 billion in transportation improvements in Western Riverside County. We've helped complete 111 projects since the project's inception and anticipate to be able to provide funding to over 75 more projects. We anticipate being able to provide $375 million in funding to the jurisdictions just over the next 5 years. So that's great and all, but is the TUMF program really accomplishing its goal of accommodating for trips on major arterials for travel within Western Riverside County? There's a request to better understand this question. So we commenced a travel behavior analysis via an origin destination assessment and utilizing big data and various other commuting data sources. So our main data source was the Streetlight data platform, which provides data points from smartphones and navigation devices. We also utilized California Household Travel Survey data and the Longitudinal Employer Housing Dynamics Survey data. So I think Dr. Collins kind of pointed out there, posed this question, but I pose this question again just to kind of gauge your thoughts. But where are most of the trips traveling to and from in Western Riverside County? I'll come back to this question in a few slides, but kind of think about your daily travel as well. So a bulk of our analysis focused on data from the Streetlight data platform. Streetlight data is the name of the company. It's the data did not come from Streetlight polls. We get that question quite a lot. Streetlight data provided about 100 million trip records in 2019 and 2021. By way of definition, trip record is a two-way trip or round trip. We also understood that the past few years haven't exactly been typical when it comes to travel behavior. So that's why we analyzed travel in 2019 and travel in 2021. So overall, the number of trips did go down when comparing 2019 and 2021 trip records, but the trip distribution and percentages were very similar. So what did our analysis cover? The analysis covered the following: the origin of trips traveling into the boundaries of each of our member jurisdictions, the destination of trips traveling from each of our member jurisdictions. It also looked into trip distances, trip types, trip distribution to and from each of our member jurisdictions during the PM peak hour. So wanted to provide a little bit of a reprieve and from the analysis to pose this question. Are the following images familiar when you consider vehicular travel in Western Riverside County? So, you have the congestion on the 91, which looks very familiar, even though this is probably a very dated photo. You might also think about logistics centers and warehouses. And you also think about the challenges the challenges or opportunities that come with the logistics centers and warehouses. And then just to throw a bone out there for people like me that really appreciate active transportation, I threw in active transportation, but I guess as an agency, we're trying to bring active transportation more into the conversation. And how many of the trips do not start or end at home? So I really posed that question to gauge your travel behavior, to see if your travel behavior matches with what our analysis found. So that image of the congestion on the 91, it is real. Some people see it on a daily basis, but actually our analysis found that approximately 90% of all trips recorded made in the WRCOG subregion start and end within the subregion. So that means that about only 10% of the trips recorded had either an origin or destination outside of the Western Riverside County subregion, with a majority of those trips beginning or ending in San Bernardino County. A majority of the trips were either non-work trips. So they were trips to and from shopping, eating, school. So hence my question about your daily travel behavior. what we're finding is a majority of the trips that were part of the analysis, they're really during the day. They're not, going from home to work or home to school. It's what you do in between the day, going to the gym, going to get something to eat, going to get much needed coffee, those types of trips. So we also found that a majority of the trips either stayed in their home city or home jurisdiction or traveled to an adjacent city. And I'll get more into that hopefully at the very end. So one qualitative conclusion that I found was that the more established jurisdictions, so either an older jurisdiction or a jurisdiction that offers that has the land uses that can be utilized throughout the day, they had a larger share of trips stay within the jurisdiction. And I can get into that in the upcoming slides. So this provides a quick snapshot of the trip distribution of recorded trips in Western Riverside County from our analysis. You can see that just about 90% of the recorded trips, just under 90% of the recorded trips stay in the subregion, both in 2019 and 2021. So we were very clear that we wanted to analyze both years, just because travel behavior has kind of fluctuated between the prior to the pandemic and in 2021, kind of during the pandemic. So our analysis provided general findings for each of our jurisdictions in the form of an infographic. So I'm providing a few examples as a part of this presentation. So here is an infographic summarizing the city of Calimesa, which is kind of towards the eastern edge of Western Riverside County. And it borders Yucaipa. And I purposely utilized Calimesa to kind of show you, to show you some of what I was discussing about kind of either older or larger jurisdictions being able to kind of showing that they contain a lot of their trips internally. So City of Calimesa is a smaller population. So looking at the results, this helped draw a conclusion that the smaller jurisdictions and Calimesa is still rapidly developing. So I would also say it's kind of a less established jurisdiction. They had a smaller share of trips stay in the jurisdiction. So bringing your attention to the top right of the infographic, about 20% of the recorded trips as a part of our analysis stayed within the city. A larger portion of trips, 55%, traveled to and from San Bernardino County. Again, Calimesa borders San Bernardino County. It's right next to Yucaipa. And then 11% of the trips traveled to and from the city of Beaumont, which is a fairly larger city compared to Calimesa. On the bottom left of the infographic, we utilized the LEHD data to provide commute trip distance and direction. Also, the LEHD data is showing that there are a lot more commute trips starting in the city than ending in the city. So again, kind of showing that the city is more of a bedroom community. So moving on, here's an infographic for the city of Corona. City of Corona is a larger city. For Western Riverside County, it's considered a larger city on the western side of the subregion. It's an older city, so it's able to offer land uses throughout the day, such as work, entertainment, shopping, etc. So again, bringing your attention to the right side of the infographic, it's showing that over 50% of the recorded trips were within the city boundaries. In addition, 37% of the trips were to and from neighboring cities. So Corona is next to Norco, East Vale, parts of the unincorporated county, as well as the city of Riverside. So of note, going back to the congestion on the 91, 7% of the recorded trips from either to or from Corona were to or from Orange County. So Again, the LHD data on the bottom left showing that the city registers a fair amount of jobs within the city, and that a majority of the commute trips are going west. I should see if there are any questions. I don't think so. Or Dr. Collins, should I just wait until the end to answer the questions?
If you'd like to answer this one question now by Paul.
Okay. Yeah.
If it fits where you are.
For sure. Hopefully I can answer it. So the question is, with the majority of total trips being non-commute trips, how do we capture those numbers or augment the commute trips to showcase the difference? So Paul, I would indicate that we could utilize big data. And this is kind of getting to the question that was asked. The concern was that a lot of the trips from Western Riverside County were really just using our arterials that we utilize. Residents, we use our tax base to construct, and we're making it really easy for them to go to their jobs in Orange County, in LA, to San Diego County. This is showing that, that is not the case, that a lot of majority of the trips that are generated by our residents either stay within your city or go to your neighboring jurisdiction. So it's showcasing this, it's bringing this to our jurisdiction's attentions. But I think we could continue to utilize big data, and that's kind of our push, is we want to utilize big data to help answer these questions, because really and I'll kind of come back to it at the end. Our focus has been kind of from a transportation policy, it's really been focused on the trips outside of the region. And so, we kind of wanted to bring this data forward to show that, there are a lot of our trips that are staying within the city. I think some participants may have also provided some feedback. John is indicating that streetlight data can provide the trip type, so commuting trips can be analyzed separately for sure. So I can go ahead and kind of do some final takeaways. So our analysis did provide a lot of talking points as an agency, but also for our jurisdictions. Our analysis commenced because of a question that came out of our TUMF program. Our TUMF program really commenced because of a collective effort from our member agencies, and they needed a way to address congestion, because traffic, they did find that traffic did not stop at jurisdiction boundaries. And, that's kind of saying something for a jurisdiction to admit, because jurisdictions, they really stay within their boundaries, and, having them kind of discuss issues that go beyond their boundaries is a big step. And they've been doing it since 2003. So, a huge credit to them. So, transportation, of course, does not stop within the boundaries. This is still the case today. I take you back to the image. Another talking point is I take you back to the image of the congestion, or some may say parking lot, on the 91. And again, a lot of our transportation policy has focused on that, where people leave the county for work. Our analysis has shown that it's actually a small percentage of the overall trips. The analysis also brought this talking point that, the land use decisions our jurisdictions make really do have a regional impact, not just an impact on your residents, because residents are traveling, either regionally or to other jurisdictions for shopping, school, work, recreation, and other reasons. Finally, as an agency, and this is kind of addressing the big data, our big data pushes, we've really tried to bring up how powerful big data can be to answer the types of questions that really may come up from city council meetings and planning commission meetings. We've had demonstrations of big data to our jurisdiction staff going back a few years now, but our jurisdictions are our jurisdictions are just quite busy. So however, we are still trying and we are going to keep trying to bring data into the conversation, because we do believe it can be a very powerful tool to answer questions in real time. So this travel behavior analysis was hopefully a good start to show how powerful big data can be for local government. It is quite expensive. But when you look at the traditional tools, we may have been able to utilize data from the travel demand model or rely on household travel survey to answer the questions, but it would have probably taken longer, and it probably would not have been as accurate because it utilizes inputs that aren't as certain as big data. And so with that, I thank you very much for your time. I'd be happy to answer questions, but I'll definitely stick around to answer questions at the end. And with that, I will turn it back to Dr. Collins.
Thank you so much, Christopher. That was great. It was a great sort of start of our conversation and looking at big data and what it can do for us. And you have another question, which was in the chat. I don't know if you want, John answered it as well, but I don't know if you want to try and look at that one. Because there is so much traffic on the 91. At times, it's hard to believe that the trips are only within the county itself. So,
yeah, Dr. Collins. So it's showing our data is showing that at least 10% of the recorded trips. And again, this isn't like a catch-all of every trip that's being made, but it is pulling cell phone data. It is pulling GPS data. So it's at least a good sample size. And so the questions, if the data is reflecting the majority of the trips are within the DEVRCOG jurisdictions, what is the explanation for the congestion on the 91? 10% of recorded trips is still quite a lot. It's quite a lot. And I think it's also just, it's also pressure points and not conflicting movements, but I'm sure the traffic engineers in the room can explain kind of the bottlenecks with all the mergers and the merging freeways. I think that's also another kind of explanation for the congestion. But I would also say that 10% of the trips are a lot, and so it's it's still something that needs to be discussed. And I think RCTC is also really looking into this, how they can alleviate the congestion on the 91.
and I have just a real quick follow-up question in thinking about the data itself. Does that also include commercial trips? So any type of big rigs? Is it just personal vehicles? What kind of vehicles are included within that?
So actually, John may will be able to answer that, but I think it's strictly vehicular trips. I don't know if if the data is refined enough to show that to show a difference between a vehicle trip and a truck trip, just because it's utilizing phone data. But I think the trips to the warehouses, those are definitely being reflected in within the analysis. And John's indicating that. So for the purposes of this analysis, we did just focus on vehicular trips, just because that was the focus of the question, and it's also the focus of our 10th program.
Yes, so I think that's good. I think it's also important, for anyone who's driven on Inland Empire freeways, that truck traffic is something special, we could say.
Yeah,
all right. Thanks so much, Christopher, and look forward to more engagement and talking about the work that you've done. So let's start over to our next poll. Let's see, here we go. And so in what way does big data advance transportation equity the most? And so information inequalities are decreased, economically stronger communities are developed, leadership develops more effective and efficient policies or programs, or transportation sustainability practices are promoted, or all of the above. And then if you have another idea, we welcome you to put it into the chat. Hopefully that shares. Okay, so as you can see, the largest piece here is, all of the above. And again, these polls are just to kind of get you thinking about what you're going to be hearing and the conversations we're going to have. But yes, it can lead to information, the decreasing of information inequalities, which, as we all know, information's power. Hopefully it builds stronger communities from that, and leadership can develop more effective policies, and transportation sustainability practices can be promoted. So we'll move on to our next speaker, who will be talking on some of these issues, Darren Welch from HNTB. We welcome you, Darren, and please.
Thank you, appreciate it. I'm happy to be here today and join the conversation. I am Darren Welch. I am the National Geospatial Manager for HNTB. I'm leading a team that manages and discovers, delivers, deploys space solutions, both custom and off the shelf. GIS, or geospatial, obviously is very, very broad discipline, and it tends to touch all aspects of transportation decision making, and equity is certainly at the forefront of all of our minds now. And hopefully I can share with you today some of the emerging patterns and areas where at least we're putting focus and seeing more focused and more innovation applied. I want to set this up with describing first the challenge, and the first one being just the lack of data. And we've talked about big data already, but I like to define that not just in terms of volume, but also in terms of data that is yet to be better understood. So misunderstood data that has not been processed, analyzed, refined to really help inform us, to be something more meaningful, and to help us be better at decision making as it affects the transportation equity of our communities. We also have seen a low utilization of geography. That is a pattern that certainly my team is trying to make a difference in the use of location, the use of space, and its overlay and influence with big data or misunderstood data as well. And lastly, we really see an importance of including outreach or stakeholder engagement as part of our equity analysis, soliciting the community, especially the communities that maybe are underserved historically. Are we finding ways or tactics to really make sure we understand what those communities are, first of all, but then are we also using approaches that ensure that they have an opportunity to and are being continually engaged as part of our project decision making? We want them to have a voice, and certainly as equal a voice of anyone else in our project areas. So how do we approach those challenges? Well, touching on the outreach aspect, we need effective ways, and I would say consistent and comprehensive ways, to really capture and also visualize stakeholder engagement. If we have really good ways to solicit and hear from our communities in an equal way, are we able to really understand that? And that's kind of where the misunderstood data aspect comes into play. Can we also measure and quantify that engagement data, especially across geography? And of course, that to me screams, first of all, are we capturing any kind of location or geography with our engagement data? And then lastly, the intent of this, and the last poll really touched on this, is are we equipping our project leaders and our agency leadership to really alter the future transportation decisions and the outreach strategies? That's really what this is all about for all of us. The first example I want to share is a project we did with Sandag for their 5 Big Moves strategy, their regional transportation plan. They used an approach that really was heavily data driven. First of all, by using their employment center data. And by the way, Sandag has this very well documented on their website of how they arrived at a lot of this data that was used for the analysis in their RTP. I won't go into a lot of those details because it is so well documented and understood. But we started this project with an evaluation, and actually did a similar OD analysis that Chris shared, using the locations of where their major employment centers are, and they actually did a analysis prior to RTP that established over 80 employment centers in their region. Then they isolated those into 4 major tiers, and using the top 2 tiers, we were able to create a series of weighted destination maps based on where anyone in the region was that lived and was arriving to those tier 1 and tier 2 employment centers. That was the basis for the live work aspect of a geo-driven data analysis. But then we needed to overlay the play aspect. Where are people going on the weekends and after work and you know, in their leisure time? For that, similar to the streetlight data in the last example, we used Terralytic data. Also uses a similar approach to streetlights and uses kind of cell phone based movement. We were able to establish those major recreational centers and centroids in a GIS layout, and we were able to overlay that as part of our data-driven analysis. What that let us arrive at are one of the moves that SANDAG established called mobility hubs. And these are basically major places of gathering through, you know, bike, walk, and transit, that all kind of coming together. They're less defined when we talk about geography, and that's why you see in this current map in a kind of a pink amoeba, we called it. So less defined in terms of allowing some of that flexibility for regional commuters to collect and really participate in movement to the larger transportation system. So the mobility hubs were kind of a central core of what led to then ultimately their transit leap corridors and the other aspects of the 5 big moves. One final aspect of overlay with this data, though, was their communities of concern. And there were 3 major drivers of their communities of concern, putting US Census data that was aggregated to some more refined location within the San Diego region. And in this screenshot of 4 images, first of all, in the top left, you see mobility hubs, and then an overlay of the 3 major demographic metrics used in the communities of concern, starting with minority population. And notice on minority screenshot, the amoeba shape in the lower right corner for a mobility hub really wasn't interfacing with one of the major areas of minority population. In fact, the top 2 mobility hubs weren't either. That told us as planners and designers, we needed to use this kind of data from communities of concern to influence perhaps the location, but certainly the shape and influence of that shape around the mobility hubs. We did the same for low income population and senior populations, primarily because those were the major drivers of communities of concern for SANDAG and their RTP decisions. Now, many agencies are starting to classify kind of these equity measures in different ways. They may be called equity priority communities. They may be called, priority populations, and they may use different metrics. And I think that's important to think about as well, of how are you as an agency defining equity? How are you educating others on how those measures were arrived at? And how are you using that data, especially with location, to influence things like future transportation decision-making? So I've mentioned outreach and its importance in evaluating equity. I want to highlight, again, the use of comprehensive engagement, consistent ways, familiar ways, and I would say consumer ways, making things consumer friendly to really get our public excited about participating in our project. And for that, we use a tool that's been developed by kind of a consortium of agencies called PIMA, the Public Involvement Management Application. It's in over 24 agencies nationally now, and you can kind of see a cross-spread map of what that engagement looks like. The orange is feedback participation by stakeholders, which is typically over 20%, and meeting participation in blue, which is typically over 30%. And that's increased a little bit actually with the pandemic, as we've all gone to more of a virtual way of engagement. I'll also highlight the amount of stakeholders engaging, and I really want to call attention to named stakeholders. We really put an emphasis on knowing who we're talking to because we want to create engaging and meaningful conversations with the audience. We want to know not just what their concerns are, what's important to them, and how we're using that to influence our transportation decisions. But we also want to know who that individual is. We want to see that individual continue to participate. You know, we want to see their name over and over again on perhaps NEPA decisions on the project or certain meeting milestones, public meetings, open houses, and so on. We want to see that individual. So we certainly get a much higher number of anonymous participants, and we discourage that necessarily, but we really do try to put an emphasis on named stakeholders and knowing who we're dealing with. And that's what that 75,000 number. So when we talk about connecting with our communities, you know, how do we do that in a way that I've shared in a consistent pattern? It takes multiple venues, frankly, but I think the important thing is to always use a single system or a single software solution, a single database, if you will, to always gather that information and understand it, right? Coming back to big data being often misunderstood. Are we collecting information through a variety of tools, perhaps, that is in a central source of truth that we can further understand and analyze the information, multiple sources? That's going to come through our typical mailing list or our registration list that's often on the project website or maybe advertised through social media. That's going to come through surveys and polling. We've done those today, right? It often happens in virtual meetings especially, but it may come through demographic surveys. That's a new kind of emerging area that agencies are starting to put more focus on that would take questions a little further than even Title VI questions, right? Asking people in an anonymous way, but still trying to capture location, at least by things like zip code. We want to understand more about the individuals that are participating in our projects. It's also going to come through feedback or comment forms. Those are one of the most a pulse of what the public is saying. And I would encourage everyone to use not just an open text box type approach, right, where you're asking the individual what's important to you. Use other tactics like drop-down menus or button choices to say, tell me the topics that are important to you. Is it noise? Is it cost? Is it proximity to, transit stations? Whatever that may be, make those some keywords or key topics in your engagement forms that you can more easily, purge through the data and really understand what the individuals are saying. Meetings, we've been in a very much a virtual meeting setting, of course. Only those have been in person. I think we're starting to see more of a hybrid approach, but certainly more still slanted toward the virtual scene. But we have to make those feel friendly. We have to make those feel human. And I think making those as personal as possible, even in an online setting, is important. Like we're meeting today, we're showing ourselves, right? We're having open dialogue, but still using a single system to capture what was shared in the meeting, who said it, what was important to them, and come back to that central source of truth of engagement data. Social media is an emerging area of stakeholder feedback as well. It's still a little bit of a platform where individuals can tend to be, less accountable. We may know who the individual is, certainly, but it often isn't held to the same substantial feedback on the project through our comment forms. But it is something that we still need to factor in and determine ways to effectively integrate and relate that information in our single source of truth of engagement. These solutions all have to be mobile friendly. That seems like a no-brainer, but I think it's as we see more virtual engagement occur, especially and as we're seeing, younger, more consumer minded generations participate and get excited about our projects, we have to keep things very mobile friendly. We have to also keep them accessible. When we go mobile, we still have to think about ways that we can be accessibility compliant? Are we using appropriate color use? Are we using keyboard friendly solutions to engage with our public? Are we gathering that information about our public as well? That can come through some of the survey participation. And are we understanding what version of our, what quantities or aspects of our community require those kind of accommodations? That has to also be stored in our central source of truth. We also have a number of augmented reality and virtual reality solutions as a way to encourage participation. I think we saw more of a spike of this in the early days of the pandemic, and it's settled down a little bit, but I think there's still a lot of value in providing those new and I'll call it fun, right? Those are fun ways to engage when you can hold your phone up on the street, see what a project might look like with different options. Have you be able to provide feedback on your preference or your recommendations of that change? But again, we have to gather all of these in a single source of truth so that we can do further analysis on it as part of that equitable transportation decision making. Do we really know what everyone is saying through all of these different media formats? And are we able to paint a picture of that? And that's really where I want to go next. So as we gather all of this information, this is a project in Wisconsin for the Twin Cities to Chicago rail study. This is an aspect of querying to see where are the less favorable individuals. So of the, I think this was about 4,000 individuals that participated in a feedback milestone on the project. In about a 3-week period, we got about 4,000 participants. This is querying to see, show me the less favorable supporters of the project, and I really want to understand what they're saying, why they're saying it. They're individuals talking about less access to this new transit route. We're overlaying that with low-income census boundaries, census block groups in this case. We're overlaying that to really understand, are these individuals who are less supportive and talking about things like access to transit corridors, are they also in perhaps areas of persistent poverty, right? Could we go back and look through the data and see, yeah, through the last 2 major census surveys, they have been in an area of persistent poverty. But we can use other overlays as well, right? This is GIS based again. We can use EJ data. We can use data about smartphone or internet accessibility. We can use all of these pieces of information to really understand more about the individual and the immediate community in which they live, at least as defined by census. Collecting this kind of information, and especially location-based, is also a way to be more transparent. So we're asking the public to share a lot of information with us, but we feel it's also important to share that information back to the community. Now, there's hesitation around this, frankly, to be cautious about, do we really want others to see what everyone is saying about the project? We've actually found this to be a very positive way to encourage more feedback on the project. And in fact, we tend to see more neutral to positive trending support on our projects when we start tracking it, more than just a feel of, there's a lot of negative support on this project. But when you start tracking it and you give individuals a platform to share where they live, what's important to them, how they feel about the project currently, and maybe some of those hot topics that they want included as part of the project decision making, that it's a really great way to encourage others to also participate. When you go on an application like this and you're able to quickly see what others are saying about the project, and I should point out the personal information, the PII is scrubbed. There's nothing personal showing on any of this data. It's all very anonymous looking, but it shares the exact feedback that the individual shared about the project, where on the project they shared that feedback, what the important topics to them are. And one of the pieces I like in particular is it shows what the agency said back. You have a threaded conversation of the exact dialogue that occurred with that individual on the project. And we always like to provide a way to, if this were to inspire you based on what you've seen others have said, we find that this is a great way to prompt you to also share your feedback on the project. So how do we bring all this data together? What can we do with this information? This is the latest kind of innovation around the ability to gather all this engagement data and then overlay it with a huge amount of demographic metrics that are available in this from U.S. Census. And we're just on the verge of getting the official 2020 census data, but this is using the latest ACS numbers from 2019, I believe, just as a proof of concept. What we're able to do and what we're calling an equity dashboard is really with an overlay of all this engagement, participation, and census block group data in this example. Where is our outreach effective? Where are we getting the most outreach? And we can query to see in what communities is that happening. And we can be very specific in the query of those communities. We can look for combinations like show me low-income communities higher than 40%, show me minority communities that are higher than 50%, show me households with no internet access more than 50%, and so on and so forth. Again, all of those metrics available from the census. We've done some post-processing, of course, to make it a little more friendly in a dashboard like this. But what you're able to do is start using this information to not just see where outreach is being effective, but more importantly, and what we feel like is the better value of an application like this is where are we lacking? If I see red on the map, which indicates a block group that has no engagement, if I've arrived at the display of those block groups because I'm looking for some key demographic metrics about my community, I'm failing at least in some way with engagement in those areas. So I need to change my outreach tactics, or perhaps I have used outreach tactics and I'm still getting no engagement, but I can use a single system of engagement to at least document what engagement has been attempted in those communities. And so where we're trying to go with this is demonstrate that engagement has occurred in an equitable way, and engagement has occurred in a way that has provided the entire project community, and that may be several miles away from the project corridor, even down to even the urban core, but we have solicited from the community in a consistent and effective way that is data-driven and is a way that we can demonstrate how we have heard what the individuals have said in the project and let that influence our future transportation decision-making. And I'll close there for any questions, or I can hold till the end.
Thanks so much, Darren. Lots of great information there. Yeah, I'd like to discuss it more at the end. Unless we have any quick questions right
Sure.
now, Darren, we can do that. Not seeing any. I'll jump into the next poll, and then we will have our
Great.
our final presentation, and then I'm looking forward to the discussion. So our next question for you is, let me launch this. What do you believe is the most significant result of utilizing big data in transit? So more reliable arrival times, better route planning, ability to cover the demand from underserved communities, or all of the above? All right, we'll end the poll here at a little over 1 minute. Share the results. So as you can see, of course, all of the above, and we have with 71%, a few others looking at the route planning and ability to serve the demand. And then we have one other. I don't know if the others out there, if you'd like to put your thoughts into the chat, that would be great. Sharing. With that, we have for our next presentation, a student group that is made up of students from UCR, Preston Reed, Holly Chi from CSUSB, and Shang Tan, who's with the Planning and civil engineering program over at Cal Poly Pomona, and they've been looking at big data and equity within the transit system. And so, Preston, Holly, Shane, the floor is yours.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Dr. Collins. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having us here as part of the dialogue series this morning. We're excited to share with you the research that we've been doing and how we've been using big data in order to quantify public transit equity. First, we'll do a brief introduction of our team, starting with my colleague, Preston.
Hi guys, I'm Preston Reed. I'm a computer science major, getting my MS at University of California, Riverside, and I'm actually graduating this June.
I'm Holly Shea, and I'm an MBA student at California State University, focusing on business intelligence, and I'll be graduating in December.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shin Tan. I'm a civil engineering major with emphasis on geospatial engineering, fourth year undergrad student at Cal Poly Pomona. I'm also actually graduating this spring semester. And our faculty advisors are Dr. Zhang from Cal Poly Pomona, Dr. Ho from CSUSB, Dr. Collins from CSUSB, and Dr. Rafi from CSUSB.
Thank you, Sheng. So I'm going to give an overview of what we'll be talking about today with our research. I'm going to first start off with an introduction of what we studied and why we studied it. Then Preston's going to go over some of the data that we needed and tools that we used for our studies. And then followed by that, he will also look at how we quantified public transit equity, what research we did, what analysis we did, and what our results were. And then Sheng is going to look at what we're currently studying right now. So to go over the introduction, first we're going to talk about the conference paper that we've done. The topic of this was shifts in public transit equity during the COVID-19 pandemic, a case study at Riverside, California. And this paper was accepted for the International Conference on Transportation and Development that's held by the American Society of Civil Engineers. So we're looking at presenting this in early June there. So I'm going to go over why we did this study, who we did the study on, what is the study about, where we did it, and when is the time frame we did the study. So starting off with our why. So we started our research here during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the topic of the effects of the pandemic was really relevant to us, and we wanted to see how it's affecting the community around us. Then we also looked at the public transportation industry and some of the priority goals. So looking at the California Transportation Plan, for example, we saw this topic of public transit equity for their goals for 2040 and repeated again in 2050. So we were really interested in looking at this topic more and how the pandemic would have maybe affected it. So we looked at doing a disadvantage index in order to quantify this and seeing how different groups were affected over this time period. We wanted to also look at an area that had continued growth. So for this, we looked at Riverside, as it's one of the largest growing counties in population in the state. So just looking at a little time period of how this began. So we're looking at the population increase of Riverside. It increased over 200% between 1980 and 2020. And then again, recently, it's been continuing to grow over 10% between 2010 and 2020. So then the COVID-19 pandemic came, and the first case in January 6 came to North America, and this caused a disrupt in the industry. Just 3 months later, we saw ridership drop by about 90% across North America. And 1 month later, RTA, Riverside Transit Agency, cut their schedule in half and reduced to a Sunday schedule. And so we want to see what effect this had on the community. And the cases continued to peak all the way through February 2021. So this was over a long period of time that this affected the community. So looking at who we studied, we were looking specifically at disadvantaged communities, and this can be defined in, as I said before, in many different ways. The indicators that we used for this was income level, education level, and poverty level. And from this, we had done literature reviews on different studies that were done of the pandemic of transit equity and different indicators that were used. And from that, that's where we developed our methodology here. For the data, we used the average income, education, and poverty for census tracts. So this is per 4,000 persons to give an idea of how big this is. Here we can see the state of California in red. Then further on, we can see this is considered a county in California. And then further down, a smaller area would be the census tract. There's even smaller areas of blocks and block groups, but for our study, the census tracts was the best method of data for us. Moving on to what we studied. So this is public transit equity, and there's many different aspects of equity. What we looked at specifically was job accessibility and service frequency for advantaged and disadvantaged populations, which we defined by using an index that we'll go over later on. So looking at the communities, both advantaged and disadvantaged, and how they were able to access jobs before and after the pandemic, if that changed in the frequency that they were able to access these jobs. For this, the frequency would help, would define what type of jobs they were able to go to, what time frame. If it was once and only one trip per day, if it was 5 trips per day, would limit them in what areas they were able to access. So these were important factors for us. So the area that we were looking at was Riverside County. So for this, we looked at specifically at Riverside Transit Agency, which services the western portion of Riverside County. Just for a snapshot, the population is 2.4 million people in Riverside County, and RTA serves about 1 million of this population, which covers a 2,500 square mile radius, just to give an idea of the area that we're talking about. So we're looking at the COVID-19 pandemic. So for this, we studied 2 time periods, one that we considered pre-pandemic, which we did as of data of January 2020, and then what we considered a recovery period. And we defined this as when vaccinations rolled out and the area started to open back up and restrictions were lifted. So we used the time period of July 2021. So moving on, we're going to look at what data we needed in order to do this analysis. And I'll pass it off to Preston to do this.
Hello, everyone. So yeah, like Holly said, I'm going to be going over the data that we used, the tools that we used, and then how we used those data and tools in conjunction with each other to quantify public transit equity. So the first major source of data that we needed was information about the public transportation system in question, which is the Riverside Transit Agency. We use something called the General Transit Feed Specification, or GTFS for short. This is open source data that's published by transportation agencies, and it's updated usually every few months. And it basically gives a snapshot of what the public transportation system looks like at any given time. So the cool thing about this is that we can look at historical data, so data that's already been posted in the past, to look at those time periods of before the pandemic and after the pandemic. You can see some required files here. They include stops, routes, and trips, and this is really important for mapping out the transit system and getting data from that. The next major source of data we looked at was census data. You would typically go to the census.gov website to gather this data. However, we ended up using the ESRI database a lot more. ESRI, for those of you who don't know, is a geographical information system company. They make ArcGIS Pro, which is really useful software. And they provide census data in the form of shapefiles and other file formats that make it really easy to work with inside of their software. So we ended up using that a lot. This is where we gathered those indicators for disadvantaged communities, median income, education level, and poverty level. And we also gathered additional data from the ESRI database that we also used to help the analysis. So the tools that we used, like I mentioned, we used ArcGIS Pro. This allows us to analyze the data and visualize it, and also work with it in a table format and calculate certain things. So just as an example here, I have a screenshot of 4 bus stops in ArcGIS Pro that we mapped out. And these pink areas surrounding each bus stop is actually the walking radius. So how far can you walk within 15 minutes of any bus stop? So that's just a little example of what you can do in ArcGIS Pro. And this is what we're going to be using for our analysis. So how did we actually use the data and tools to quantify public transit equity? Well, the first thing that we wanted to look at again was identifying those disadvantaged communities. We developed that disadvantage index that Holly talked about using indicators of poverty, income, and education. We were able to break down the population of Riverside County into 5 groups from most advantaged to least advantaged based on these indicators, where the most advantaged communities had lower poverty and higher income and higher education, where the least advantaged communities had higher poverty, lower income, and lower education levels. So you can see here, these are all the census tracts in a portion of Riverside County, mostly Western Riverside County. The darker blue regions are more disadvantaged communities, and the lighter shaded regions are the more advantaged communities. And then here we have a pie chart sort of breaking down these 5 groups. So again, index group 1 would be the most advantaged population, and index group 5 would be the least advantaged population. You can see here that the most advantaged population only takes up about 7% of the population, whereas the least advantaged group takes up about 33% of the population. And for our analysis, we're actually going to be comparing index groups 1 and 5, so the most advantaged to the least advantaged. So yeah. The next part is we're going to look at job accessibility using commute time. So this again was one of our indicators for actually quantifying public transit equity. We want to see how many jobs you can access if you're living in a disadvantaged community using a 30-minute commute time compared to if you're in a more advantaged community using a 30-minute commute time. So here we have that same disadvantage index map, and this pink area is showing the 30-minute commute service area. This is actually specifically showing the areas that you can reach if you are living in a disadvantaged census tract. So if you're starting your day living in a disadvantaged census tract, which areas can you reach within the county? And also how many jobs can you access within this area? And we actually have some pretty interesting results. You can see with these percent changes from before the pandemic to during the pandemic, the least advantaged communities could actually access more jobs after the pandemic had started versus before the pandemic. The most advantaged communities actually saw a large decrease in the amount of jobs that they could access going from before the pandemic to during the pandemic. And in total, there was a mild decrease of about 3% in the total job accessibility. The next indicator here is service frequency. So how often are buses coming by bus stops? This is usually measured in runs per hour. So here we also have that disadvantage index map, and all these dots on here are bus stops in the disadvantaged census tracts. Green indicates a frequently serviced bus stop, where red indicates a less frequently serviced bus stop. So with a green bus stop, you can see there's about 16 to 20 buses per hour going through that bus stop. So looking at these results, we see that there's a decrease across the board, but it's important to note here that the least advantaged communities actually had less of a decrease compared to the most advantaged census tracts, and also the total decrease across the entire transportation system. And so what can we conclude from these results? Well, we saw that the service changes from the RTA seem to assist the most disadvantaged populations. And also based on our literature review, we found that disadvantaged populations are a lot more likely to be dependent on transportation services, public transportation services. And so this is a big win for public transportation mobility and public transit equity, and also mobility justice for these disadvantaged communities. And I'm going to pass it on to Shane to show how we're developing this work further to be more accurate.
Thank you, Preston, and I'll be going over the developing work / ongoing work. So our paper was focusing on the supply by using the data from job accessibility to service frequency from the transit agency, which shows us how well they supply the community with their services. But our future and ongoing work will be more focusing on the demand side, which is also the ridership side. So you may ask, how do we estimate the demand? So we are planning on looking into more data on population to narrow down the percentage of the transit dependent population, which means they are mostly relying on using the bus or the metro to get around, get groceries, get to work and all that. And as you can see on the graph, the green area represents a walking area from any bus stop within 10 minutes for anyone. So by overlaying it to the census tract, we can estimate what percentage of the population has a reasonable access to the bus services, which are all in the green region. And also we are planning on overlaying this layer, the transit gap index, to the disadvantage index to see how much percentage it overlays and how much percentage of the disadvantage area are actually in the transit gap index area. Next slide, please. And also we are planning on looking into more transit agencies, not only the Riverside Transit Agency. We're also will be looking into Foothill Transit and Omnitrans, which covers the whole Southern California region within 5 counties. Also, we are planning on doing more time periods. We are splitting the time periods into 3: a pre-pandemic, which is September 2019 to May 2020; the peak COVID time period, which is from March 2020 to January 2021, which has relatively high COVID cases every day; and a recovery period from May 2021 to January 2022. Since the vaccine are rolling out, people are getting vaccine, people are getting recovered from COVID. So we're splitting time periods into 3. And that concludes our presentation. We're open for questions.
All right, thank you so much, Preston, Holly, Chang. Great presentation. Great to see the work advancing. And before we get into our question and answer piece, we have one more poll question for you. And then we'd like to get to a discussion on what we've heard today and bring the topics together. So this last piece is just really thinking about who should be answering these difficult issues. It's the nonprofit sector. Is it the public sector, private sector? And then all 3 working together, which we consider in the policy field, really that idea of network governance. So as we can see, the majority think that it should be all 3 working together. Of course, we need the help from government as well as business, working with the nonprofit sector, as we saw today with Darren's presentation, really thinking about how can we bring in more community development. So with that, I'd like to open up the floor. Thank you all for answering, to comments, questions, discussion. So please, if you have any questions, please bring them forward for our speakers. And I can get us started as usual. Darren, question for you. Have you seen any impact to data acquisition during the pandemic? Has COVID impacted at all the amount of data or the type of data that's available?
I guess I'll break that into 2 parts. One is just kind of mobility data. Some of the vendors talked about today already: Streetlight, Teralytics. There's all SafeGraphs, Replica, great vendors out there. I don't know that the pandemic influenced the availability of it, but I think certainly the awareness of using data to help make more informed decisions is an area that vendors are trying to emphasize and make it more regular in terms of its updates, beyond quarterly in some cases. In terms of outreach data, the other category, the pandemic absolutely influenced that. We were seeing just virtual meeting participation alone oftentimes at least double, if not triple, quadruple, or more in comparable type meetings that were historically in person. And so that didn't just tell us that the public is ready to participate that way, but also, again, we're using that information to help base our project decisions, right? So that told us that we can use those kind of platforms to actually get more participation, understand location as part of that if we're gathering that, and continue to find ways to elevate the virtual setting to hopefully increase it even more. The stats I showed for commenting around 20% and meeting participation around 30% of all stakeholders, I think that's still a little low. I'd love to see, something much closer to 50%. And I think as we continue to adopt ways, especially with mobile devices and more of an app consumer approach, I think we'll start getting the younger generation excited about their role in transportation decision making.
Mhm. And just a real quick follow-up on that. Are you using something like many cities maybe have a 511 number or 311 number where there can be reporting and the community can really focus on specific pieces within their communities? My city has one of those that if you're out wandering and about, you can log into the website or call, text in a number.
Yeah.
Problems within the city. Is it something within that, or is it really just community engagement where you have community planning meetings or such?
Yeah, I've been speaking much more to the latter, where it's really project focused. I think most agencies have a good 511, 311, or
Whatever.
things like manhole, pothole reporting apps, things like that. But we're certainly much more focused on being individuals engaged on projects. We want you as the member of the traveling public to understand the project first of all, and once you understand it, how can you have a voice in crafting the direction of that project? And so our focus is trying to give them ways via text messaging, certainly email address, mobile app notifications. We're looking at things like gamification. Can you earn points on a project, for example, by participating more and in different ways? And you get a reward for that, right? Is that maybe in a transit project, is that a free pass for a month? We're looking at all those kinds of things to really encourage more of that participation at a project level.
That's great. So I have more questions, but we'll move on to Carrie. Carrie, please.
Dr. Collins, you knew I would have a question.
I knew you would.
At least one question, and I do. And this one's for the students. And maybe some of our experts, Christopher and Darren, you might want to have some insight into this, but the information you showed on changes in access to jobs was interesting to me and actually a little counterintuitive. And I'm just wondering, from my own interpretation without much background here, but I assume that a lot of the reduction in access, especially for the less advantaged communities, was a result of reductions in transit service, and that perhaps some of I'm just interested in whether it was reduction in transit service or whether it was maybe related to reductions in congestion on the highways during COVID, allowing you to go further in a 30-minute time period, et cetera. And then I'm also interested in why the difference. Why did it affect the disadvantaged community less than the more advantaged communities? And in terms of congestion relief on the highway during COVID, I'm wondering why that didn't also benefit the more advantaged. It seemed like it benefited the disadvantaged more than the advantaged, and I'm wondering why that is.
Yeah, so these are all really great questions, and we've had lots of meetings discussing this internally. So we can't really answer those questions directly, right? We don't have enough data to sort of answer those questions. But I think maybe maybe transit service was sort of directed. I mean, we think that the RTA was directing their services more towards these disadvantaged populations, and that's why we saw that difference. Also, what was I going to say? For the more advantaged communities, sorry, I totally lost my train of thought. Yeah, so I mean, again, really hard to answer this question.
Do you think that reduction of congestion on the highways, what effect do you think that had? And
oh yeah,
why?
sorry. Yeah, that's what my train of thought was. So we actually looked at one time of day during one day of the week. So we looked at Wednesday at noon. And so that can definitely have an effect. And that's the limitation of the study, is that when you look at different hours of the day and different days of the week, the service will change. So potentially, like if we looked at different days of the week, maybe weekend service or even Friday service, and in the morning, these results would definitely change. Yeah.
Interesting. Christopher, do you have any, just because of your knowledge of the patterns in the local region, is there anything there that rings a bell for you?
Possibly, because I'm not too familiar with the kind of the transit, but one possible scenario is that, you know, they basically moved to Sunday operations during COVID, and they could, those Sunday operations and, you know, the frequency of routes could be really focused. Hopefully it's focused in those areas in which transit is needed. And, you know, it's for residents to get around, they need transit. That's one kind of idea that popped up, is because it was Sunday service throughout the pandemic, or at least in the beginning of the pandemic, that, you know, that could be an answer or a hypothetical in terms of, you know, Carrie, your specific question. That just came to my head.
No, I think you're probably right that you know, the basic service, those routes were probably less reduced than the express bus services during the morning commutes and things like that, for sure. Thank you.
We have another question here for Darren in the chat. Could you explain how you constructed the equity dashboard in greater detail? Was this an ESRI generated dashboard using census data and the data captured by PIMA? Just from further clarifications.
Yeah, great question. That was indeed, I should have mentioned that was developed with the Esri ArcGIS online dashboards tool. It is something we wanted to establish as a way to use off-the-shelf tools that most agencies have invested in to leverage, you know, data coming from multiple sources. One would be, as you've asked, PIMA for kind of a central source of truth for engagement information, and census data as kind of the primary demographic piece of information. I will say that the census data, as you saw it in the dashboard, was post-process. We've gone through an internal exercise of, because the census data is you know, in numerous other tables, depending on what demographic features you're looking for and at what level of detail. We've set up some kind of repeatable processes to be able to run that every year, you know, new ACS comes out, and run those formulas so that we can get exact counts and exact percentages in each block group or tracked or higher levels, you know, if we want to go to county or statewide. So a bit of, you know, behind the scenes work to get that going, but the dashboard, once the data is ready, obviously, and able to be connected to the dashboard, is something you can a little more easily redeploy, call it a template if you will, redeploy on other projects if you want to focus it on a per project level, or you could look at, you know, statewide engagement on multiple projects. You could filter by project or look at all projects together in that ArcGIS online dashboard format.
Great. Preston, do you have a follow-up to that question?
Yeah, actually, I was kind of curious. So you're using census data for your application, and you're also surveying people. So I'm wondering if you ever ask questions that are directly related to the census data, and whether you sort of do a cross-reference to see, I guess, like I'm asking if you're sort of continuing the census within your application, you know, updating it and cross-referencing with previous census data to see if those things still hold true.
That's a fantastic question. We kind of arrived at the same conclusion, Preston, that as I mentioned, a lot of the agencies we work with are starting to craft their own sort of demographic surveys. And that was one of the immediate recommendations, at least by our team, was make it as relatable to the same classifications that the census is using for each demographic metric, right? That way you can compare the information. We're certainly not trying to supplement or replace census. We think there's value in having both. There's also danger in relying too much on a demographic survey because you are at the mercy of how much your community is participating in that, right? But if we can get the data somewhat standardized or as standardized as possible to match the way census classifies it, we can at least do a bit more of an apples to apples comparison based on what how the community makeup is classifying themselves versus how census is classifying themselves. Yeah.
I'm formulating a question in my mind because I've been to a lot of community, and I'm not sure how to exactly ask. I've been to a lot of community events looking at, you know, maybe environmental justice issues or transportation issues. And sometimes there's really a disconnect, even though there's a lot of information given, just because of the technicalities or the you know, the expertise that's behind and the nuances that are behind a lot of the information that's being provided. How have you seen that, and how have you dealt with that type of really getting a full clarity of what the purpose is and moving forward, so that there can be a greater kind of appreciation and embracing by the community of what's happening?
Yeah, great question. And I'm not sure, even with the best information, you know, at present, based on historical engagement, maybe even the same project area, I'm not sure if you always get it right, you know. However, we try to begin all of our engagement milestones, which would be something like an open house, right, or a public hearing. We try to begin those with three main questions. What do we want to share with the public? What do we want to hear back from the public as a part of that sharing? And what do we want to do with that data? And so we try to let that drive how we sort of message everything we're taking to the public at that particular milestone. That's an emphasis on visuals. We certainly have seen, I would say, a bit more effectiveness when we can do 3D visualizations. You know, click on a YouTube link and watch some alternatives of how your bridge replacement is going to occur over this, you know, weekend, so that it doesn't affect your commute, you know, things like that. We've also had, I think, more effectiveness now. I mentioned AR, VR. We have been able to work out processes where we can take the design data for, let's say, an interchange or an intersection improvement, go right out there to the intersection with the residents that, you know, own property, own right of way at that intersection. They can put on a HoloLens, or they can hold up an iPad, and they can see exactly how the design or perhaps alternatives are going to affect their property, maybe even their front porch. And that's a very clear way to, may face some opposition, of course, it's a very clear way to convey what exactly is happening. That said, I think also having a consistent engagement system allows you to see trends in what individuals are saying, so that you can see, were you off message or were you confusing, right? If your intent to share at a public hearing was on the overall project goals, but everybody's raising their hand and of concern on you know, lack of noise walls or something, right? Then that's going to tell you through the day need to maybe have a follow-up meeting or email or a particular video messaging segments on the website that clarifies those points. And so we try to let the data inform us of, corrections that perhaps we need to make as well.
That's great.
So there's no one size, I would say to that. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I've been to many meetings and, and talked to community members while they're there and they're like, why am I here? And you feel disappointed because you're like, you're here because it's really important that you're here and that we hear from you, but it's difficult.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, so I think it's, and Darren kind of hit this, but I think it's really important that as a government entity or as a consultant working for a jurisdiction for a specific project, I think it's really important to understand that the residents are there. They don't really know the technicalities of a project, and I think it's very easy for city staff or consultant to get really technical. But I think it's very obvious. But you want to make sure that the materials and hopefully you're not doing a really, really long presentation. It's more of them. It's more of you listening to their ideas. But I think it's also really important about the materials and the content that we provide, that it's understandable for the residents and understandable, like you're trying to identify their issues and you're trying to hear what their solutions are and you're trying to provide solutions for their issues. And I think sometimes I've been to some of those meetings and you're like, I'm kind of a professional, but I don't understand what is being communicated because it just gets really into the weeds. And, as planners, as engineers, there's that connotation that we get really technical, but not everybody is as brilliant as the folks in this on the Zoom call. So I think it's just kind of something we probably need to focus on more of who we are presenting to.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thank you, Christopher. We have another question for you, and this is what I was thinking as well. So you showed us a detailed analysis for the two cities. So what do you think is the next step? What are you guys going to do with the data? And how can we think about using this data between the cities and maybe the counties?
Yeah, so Rafi, there's a great question. So we've created an infographic, kind of a summary, and kind of to provide all of our jurisdictions, the results of our analysis. I guess as an agency, we're kind of just leaving it to that. We are offering a presentation to all of our respective city councils. We haven't presented this to our governing board. We're expected to present this to them at the end of June. But as a part of that presentation, we will follow up and make sure that we offer presentations to each jurisdiction. Our overall hope with big data is that our jurisdictions see how powerful it can be, because I'm sure when you go to city council meetings, residents come and discuss or complain about congestion or just a general traffic issue. Our hope is that jurisdictions can see that big data is something that can be utilized to answer those questions. And I was going to indicate that if there are groups, consultants that have examples of which have applicable examples to our jurisdictions, and they would like to disseminate that information, send me an email. We have a monthly committee meeting with our planning directors as well as our public works directors. We share we utilize that meeting besides doing official agency business, but to also provide to disseminate some useful information or tools. And so I was going to encourage anybody that has either conducted some analyses or studies that are really applicable to jurisdictions of the size of a Temecula or Lake Elsinore, please contact me. Because we're trying to push this big data to them, because I think it is a really useful tool. Again, it is quite expensive. So what we actually did is we hired a consultant that has a streetlight data. Basically, they have access to streetlight data, and that was a very cost efficient way for WRCOG as an agency to conduct this analysis. So our next step is really kind of on the larger picture for big data, is to really try to keep pushing big data as a way to look into the questions, because you could do counts, you could do 2 counts, you could do all sorts of things, but we really think big data provides another option and a faster option to conduct an analysis.
All right, thank you, Christopher. We have another question, but if there's any questions for those who are here, because I love that people are asking questions in the chat. They're actually what I'm thinking. So, and you sort of just touched upon this, Christopher. One of the issues I see as well as, not impoverished, but not a very wealthy university center here, thinking about just the costs of the data itself. Are there suggestions for open source data? I know that Esri has, sort of an open source data piece, but accuracy at times. Where can we find the data? And Preston, Holly, I don't know if you have some ideas since you've been out there mining data. Darren or Christopher, if you also have some pieces. We need to really figure out the accessibility, or even in that piece, that equity part about who can have access to the data and how can we use it. So thoughts, Preston? Or
Yeah. Esri is a really good resource. I'm starting to wonder if it's free though, because I have to log in through the university in order to access the data. But I mean, it's a great resource. The only limitation with Esri is that you need to make sure that the data is sound and accurate. So when we pull from Esri, we only look at authoritative data sources. And that's usually from Esri themselves or from some government agency that posted on their database. Going beyond that, I mean, we've mainly just worked with census data. For the job accessibility data, though, that was a little bit harder to find. We use something called LEDS data. I forget what that acronym stands for, but it's origin destination data. And that was, I had to dig for that a little bit. And it's a little bit hard to use. You need to read the documentation in order to use it, but that was actually really valuable. And it was actually at the block group level or the block level. So it was really granular and really useful. But outside of that, I don't know any other open data sources. I actually haven't heard of AQMD. I think we did look at SCAG for street data specifically. But yeah, outside of that.
AQMD is the Southern California Air Quality Management District. So
okay.
It's the air quality board for our region.
Gotcha.
Christopher, any thoughts, or Darren, any thoughts that you've seen?
I think Preston hit on it pretty well. I mean, if you have access to ArcGIS online, then you've got a pretty good wealth of information that you can search even by region. You can kind of use the map to let you search, just for the particular area of coverage you're looking for. You got to look at the source though. There's a nice icon that shows if it's authoritative data, but I would say go beyond that to understand how the data was generated, right? Preston touched on accuracies, but you also really need to understand how was this data aggregated or processed or created or digitized, so that you know how to best utilize that in your analysis or processes. It is getting to the point though, there's a lot of good open data sources out there. It's always good to start with the county or the MPO or the city you're working with. They may have data internally too. If you're coordinating with them, you may want to look for internal sources that they just haven't made public. But then there are other sources that you may just have to look at acquiring through payment. Point of interest data in particular is really, really great through SafeGraph. And I feel like it's affordable for the information you get, and the quality of it and the regularity of it. So I think it has to be a mixture. You're not going to be able to do a lot of these, especially kind of emerging and challenging analyses, without a combination of both open source, your own processed information, and maybe some data acquisition.
Thank you. And Rafi also puts out there, we do have in the state of California, Cal and ViroScreen, which the state of California has put together. So other questions from the floor? I feel like working.
Dr. Collins, no question, but Preston, maybe you can organize a hackathon for. I'm kidding, but I thought about that when the open data sources were.
Yeah, I've organized a hackathon before. I mean, that would be fun.
Yeah, and not to put one of our participants, one of our registered, but we do have the Austin Transportation Partnership here. I don't know, Lonnie, your camera's on if you'd like to share things that are happening in the city of Austin, one of my favorite cities in the state of Texas.
I'm not really sure where you'd want me to begin. There's a kind of a multi-billion-dollar transit improvement that's happening here, and that includes 2 light rail lines, a new regional rail line, 4 new bus rapid transit lines, 9 park and rides, the expansion of our Metro bike system, and the expansion of our pickup system, which is sort of like an Uber pool, but it's the same price as a transit pass, and it's in a drop zone. So naturally, there are lots of teams that are using data of this kind. Our planning team definitely is using Esri regularly. We're also using OneView for our line work. And then recently I started using the A to Z database for information about businesses that are along the line, since construction mitigation is going to be part of the work that I do. And I guess I should have led with that. I work on the community engagement team. So I'm preparing all of the meetings and making sure that the engineers can speak English, and that Pitchfork can be translated into engineering is really important for the success of the project. So that's why I was just sitting in and listening, learning about what y'all are doing too.
All right, thank you, Lonnie. Thanks for sharing. Appreciate that. And on the minute's notice of, as I know that Austin is doing many great things. It's one of really one of the most advanced cities in some ways in the United States, really looking at multimodal transportation and bringing that to the community. So other questions, other ideas? Time for just 1 or 2 more questions or points. Carrie, did you have another question that you wanted to put forward? And then I'll also invite my faculty, Young Ping or Yunfei. Did you have any follow-ups that you'd like to say? Yes, Carrie, go. Please.
No, I really don't have anything further. This has been a fascinating discussion, and it really underscores how, excuse me, we have opportunities that are just now, as somebody mentioned, finding out where this data is, and I think Darren made reference to data that has not yet been analyzed. There's tons of data out there, and I think, and this really is across the spectrum. It's not just in equity; it's in transportation in general. I'm working on some connected vehicle projects right now, and I'm just astonished by the amount of data that exists that OEMs and other people are just collecting and archiving, because they don't currently know the value of that data, but they know it will be valuable at some point, and so they're just archiving it and saving it. And so I think that we're going to continue to see this area advance as people become aware and develop the analytical tools that allow them to parse through, these terabytes of data and come to new and, as I saw today, I mentioned earlier, surprising little bits of information that, it's kind of hard to get your hands around or your arms around it sometimes to understand what it means. But I think a lot of bright people like we have on this call today, combined with some really powerful analytic tools, I think this is an area where we're going to see advances. And I think, the ability to demonstrate progress is really important. And to do that quantitatively, it's more believable when you're able to show results in a measurable way than just saying, well, the whole equity situation sure feels better than it did 2 years ago. Well, that's not, at least for those of us who are engineers and planners, and that's not sufficient. The ability to say, look at the numbers and look at the statistics. We can not just say that it feels better, we can show that it is better. And I think those are the areas to watch in this field.
Yeah, I agree. How we can really track that we are making improvements upon the system, because some of these issues are so entrenched into how our systems work and how our institutions function. Really rethinking even in that how we interact with the community, and that whole conversation of community meetings. How do we work well so that what is happening is responding to the need there.
Well, and I think pointing it out in the ways that we've been talking about also helps. The patterns emerge that nobody expected to see, or patterns emerge that some people expected to see, but they couldn't communicate it effectively. I think it helps us build awareness, and that's also important. And so being able to do that with maps and with graphics and with dashboards in a way that people can understand, I think it just helps the cause tremendously.
I think there's been some challenge on our side with when you're looking at equity, in particular because of land cost. And I'm sure we're familiar with the redlining maps, but when you talk about investing $300 million in affordable housing, you try to find the least expensive land to work with. Or if you're trying to find your maintenance facility, you're looking for the least expensive land. But in essence, you're just doubling down on systemic racism because that land was less expensive for a reason. And I think a lot of times it's not really taken into consideration because you think you are doing the equitable thing by trying to use that money as effectively as possible. So I would just put it on your radar.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Again, that goes into a lot of the ways that our systems work and how they've developed over time. And it gets into a really deep complexity in figuring out how do you overcome that to make sure that the future systems that we develop address the inequities that have come up through time. So it's a deep complexity that's there. I also want to point that the importance of creating groups and something that we're thinking of doing, and in making sure that Caltrans, our state transportation agency, really figure out ways to share information better, to work together, to bring a future vision of what, for my purposes and a lot of the work that I'm doing, looking at 21st century sort of governance and this network governance and bringing people together so that we can find better solutions. And one way that we do that is through the dialogues, but also thinking of other ways to bring this network governance forward. So I think it's an important piece. Yunfei, did you have anything? We just have a couple more minutes. If you want to
Oh, well, I don't have further questions. I just want to take the opportunity to congratulate our students on a job well done for the research project. Well, we're proud of you and we wish you continued success throughout your college career. And I know most of you are graduating. I also want to take this opportunity to thank our partners. So this project cannot success without support from the Riverside Transit Agency, Omnitrans, Foothill Transit. We're very grateful for your continued support as well. And we hope we can keep sparking you for future projects.
Right.
And well, this has always been a pleasure to participate in Dialogue series. It goes without saying that our thanks also goes to HNTB for supporting us for over the years.
Yes, and all of our sponsors who have been really available to us and helping us with this event. So
Definitely.
thank you. Young Ping, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I learned a lot. Yeah, it's a great event, and thank you for having me here. And also, we have great students. We work very hard. It's very challenging, very difficult to look into this pandemic effect, into the transit, into the equity issues. But we're very glad we have very good students, very dedicated. Thank you all for the hard work. Thank you.
All right, last chance. Any other questions before I give just the closing remarks? No. All right, again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I invite you to join us in June when we have our next event, thinking about deciphering last mile delivery. How does it work? So we understand that there's a lot of congestion on our roads, getting to sort of the issues behind those being one, the last mile delivery, the number of warehouses and logistics facilities, and the and the movement of these smaller commercial vehicles throughout our communities, getting a chance to look at that. I would like to thank officially all of our sponsors at the platinum level, HNTB, of course, Carrie, Greg, who we won't mention where he actually is right now, then we'll all be jealous that he's on vacation. The San Bernardino International Airport, the Ontario International Airport, again, all of our platinum sponsors, our gold sponsors of Woodruff, Spraidlin, and Smart, SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments, the Southern California Gas Company, and Metrolink. And then we have a number of silver sponsors, PPM Group, HDR, Guida Surveying, Foothill Transit, Lane Engineering, GLA, Omnitrans, Advanced Civil Technologies, EXP, and Sully Miller Contracting Company. Again, thanks to all of our sponsors for your support and helping to get these dialogues moving forward. As I said earlier, we really hope through these to have this conversation, to share knowledge, and be able to move our transportation system more towards a more sustainable, equitable place. So I thank you. I wish you all a very great day and a great next rest of the week. Thanks for being here. Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.